I think we all understand that God's Word is vital to our lives. Studying Scripture is God's message to us, telling us how to live eternally in heaven. There is no more important book in the universe than the Bible. It's supernatural. It's for our good. But the Bible is not always easy to understand, particularly if we're not aware of some of the historical backgrounds to the Bible. When you read the New Testament, you read about King Herod. But where did he come from? Who was he? Why was he the king of the Jews? You read about the Romans. What did they have? How did they get there? Why were they there? Because the Old Testament doesn't say a word about the Herods or the Romans, and then suddenly in the New Testament, they're there. You got the synagogue. It's not in the Old Testament. Suddenly it's in the New Testament. What is it? Where did it come from? Why do they have the synagogue and the temple? And there's just all kinds of things that appear in the New Testament that the Bible doesn't say where they came from. Now the Jews knew where the stuff came from because they grew up in that, but we don't. So what we're doing for the last few weeks is looking at some of these historical things. Where did they come from? Why are they there? And help us to because it just opens the Bible up when you know these things and you read something and you say, now I know why. Why did the Pharisees and the Sadducees want Jesus dead? Who are they anyway? Why is things like they are? Well, that's what we're looking at. And so we are continuing our study in this area. Last week we talked about the Zealots. The Zealots were a sect of the Jews that believed in a military solution. The Romans had invaded and conquered Judea, Palestine. The Jews were under their thumbs. And the Zealots believed that the only way to handle the Romans is militarily, get rid of them. Unfortunately, over the decades and centuries, the Zealots had become criminals. They'd become more like the mafia than and they become murderers and thugs and thieves, and they were terrorists. And so they're mentioned several times in the New Testament. It just talks about the Zealots. Well, who are these people? Matter of fact, one of Jesus' apostles was a zealot. And why is that important? So they have an important role. Then the Essenes we talked about, they believe that the way to holiness is to move out of town, get by yourself and live in your own little communities, kind of like the Amish. And they were vital in history as far as make sure we've got the Scriptures. They were real big on copying the Scriptures, and the Dead Sea Scrolls came from their work. The lawyers and the scribes are mentioned several times in the New Testament. Well, who are these people? Well, they were experts in the law of Moses. They studied the law 24/7. If you had a question about some esoteric thing about the law, you went to the lawyers and the scribes. A lawyer could be either a Pharisee or a Sadducee. The Herodians were the Jews that supported the Herod family. And then everybody knows who tax collectors are, or well-loved people. But in Jesus' day, they were especially hated because they were considered traitors by the Jews. They worked for the Roman government. Most of them were dishonest because that's the way they made their money. The system was set up designed to be crooked. I mean, it just invited fraud. So that's where we got to last week. Tonight we want to start with a group that everybody hears about, but everybody knows everybody's wrong about. I grew up my whole life hearing about these folks, and I had a wrong idea about them forever. First time I preached a sermon on this, Darlene got mad at me because she said I disillusioned her. She said she had believed this about them all, and then I just blew it out the window. We're talking about the wise men, the Magi. Who are the Magi? Where do we run into them? At the birth of Jesus. Yeah, they showed up. Now, what do we know about the Magi? How many of them were there? Well, what does our tradition say? There were 3 of them. And what were they riding? camels. And we've heard the songs, We Three Kings. And so we grew up believing they were three of them. They rode camels. They were kings. And all that's wrong. Who were the wise men? Who were the magi? Well, and they do have an important role to play in the story, not just because they went to Jesus and gave him the gifts, but they had a bigger role to play in the history of the situation. The magi were actually from Persia. They were, what's that in modern day? Iran. Yeah. They were from Persia. The Persians were the arch enemies of the Romans. The one group the Roman armies feared was the Parthian cavalry, Persian cavalry. They were renowned throughout the world for their cavalry. And so the Romans had not conquered Persia. There had been a lot of conflicts between the two. They kind of left each other alone. Well, there was a tribe in Persia that over the centuries had grown to prominence for their learning and their wisdom. And they studied math and science and the stars, and they were considered to be the scholars of the ancient world. They were so prominent in the ancient world that almost every court had magi hired to be advisors to the court. But not only were they advisors, they taught the kings that were coming up, the princes. Whenever you had a son and you were the king, you hired magi from Persia to come teach your son the stuff he needed to know, because they were considered to be the great scholars of the day. It'd be like if you had a son and you had all the money, you hire a Harvard PhD to come teach your son the stuff he needed to know. Well, that's what you did with the wise men. And so almost every ancient court had wise men, magi, Persian wise men, who came in and they would train. So they trained the next generation of kings. And then when it came time to appoint a new king, the magi were always part of it, because that gave prestige and importance. If a magi gave his blessing, then that was considered important. The wise men had been told by God, years ahead of the birth of Christ, that there was coming into the Middle East a supernatural being. They didn't know he was the Messiah. They were told by God that there was some special person coming. And God told them, you go to Jerusalem, you go to Canaan, you go to Palestine, and this special person is now ready to arrive. The prophecy had told them for centuries that this person was coming. And now God said it's time, and he told them to go, and they followed the star. Now we have no clue what that means, whether it was actually a star moving or if it was a light in the sky or whatever. But they followed it to Jerusalem. When they got to Jerusalem, now these men were recognized as wise men by every court. They could go anywhere in the world and be recognized as special people. Now, they were not kings. They were scholars and teachers and advisors. They also didn't travel in groups of three. Why do we think there were three? Because there were three gifts given to Jesus. That's the only reason. But they usually traveled in much larger groups. And they also almost always traveled on horses. Why? Sir? Well, it's faster. Persians didn't ride camels. Persians rode horses. And so they were almost always accompanied by a cavalry troop of Parthian cavalry. And so this picture that we see on our Christmas cards is dead wrong. They were not kings. They didn't ride camels. They traveled in much larger groups. So in the story of Jesus' birth, we find that the magi, the wise men, show up in Jerusalem. Now, they didn't ride up on camels, three of them. They rode up with a whole cavalry troop of Parthian cavalry. So how would the king of Israel look at that? This is scary. Why would I have Parthian cavalry at my door? And the Romans, there was only a very small Roman garrison in Jerusalem. The Roman army was stationed at Caesarea, several days away. And so there wouldn't be enough Romans in Jerusalem to defend Jerusalem from a huge cavalry troop of Parthians if they got rowdy. But they show up at the door, and what do they say? We're looking for the new king. Well, boy, Herod the Great, who was king at this time, as I mentioned last time, was the most paranoid leader in history. Saddam Hussein might come in a close second. Saddam Hussein was crazy jealous of anybody. I mean, dozens of Saddam Hussein's generals died under very mysterious circumstances. And his whole family, yeah. His favorite way of getting rid of troublesome people was helicopter crashes. There was a lot of helicopter crashes in Saddam Hussein's reign. But at any rate, when the wise men showed up and they told Herod, we're looking for the new king. We've got this prophecy that said the new king has been born. Herod went nuts. I mean, he had already murdered half his family because he thought they were trying to steal his job. He had his father-in-law drowned. He had one of his wives murdered. He had two of his sons murdered. I mean, this guy was, anybody he thought that might be opposing him, they died. He was crazy. Well, these guys show up and say, we're here to see the new king. Herod went crazy. Matter of fact, the text actually says Herod was disturbed and all Jerusalem with him. Herod was so nuts. And he knew the Jews hated him because he was not a Jew. He was an Idumean. He had been appointed by the Romans to be king of the Jews because he had supported the right side in the Roman Civil War. So Herod was the king by appointment. And he was very cruel. He ruled with an iron fist. Herod was so paranoid that he thought, well, when I die, there's going to be a lot of rejoicing in Jerusalem over my death, and I don't want that. So he ordered that when he died, several prominent Jews would be executed the same day. So there'd be mourning in the city. You talk about sick. So the Magi show up, and they say, we're here to see the new king. Well, they were universally recognized as guys who knew about this kind of stuff. So they had to be taken seriously. So Herod decides, I got to find this new king and kill him. So that's where the story about the boy babies, he called in the Jewish authorities and says, where is this baby supposed to be born? And they said, well, the scriptures say in Bethlehem. Well, the Magi says, we saw this star about 2 years ago. It takes a long time to travel from Persia over to Israel. Anyway, so Herod says, well, let's kill all the boy babies 2 years old and younger just to make sure. So that's why that story happened. This is a Parthian cavalryman. This is what they would have looked like in life. They had these short recurved bows, and they were devastating to infantry. The Romans ran into them several times and lost a lot of troops to them. All right, the Bible talks about baptism. This was not a new idea to the Jews at all. They knew exactly what baptism was. This is a picture of an archaeological site that's dug up. They were called mikvah in the Jewish language. And this is where you did your ceremonial washing or your baptism. Now, to every Jew who went up on the Temple Mount, you had to have a bath first. There were dozens of these found around Jerusalem, around the Temple Mount. And before you could go up on the Temple Mount, you had to be ceremonially cleansed. And you would go take a bath, a baptism, if you will. The Jews understood baptism was a cleansing. It wasn't for a bath to take a bath. It was to be ceremonially clean. So when Jesus started talking about baptism and John started baptizing, Jews had no problem with that. They understood that concept. And so there were dozens of these found around the Temple Mount, and the Jews would have to go to ceremonially wash, and then they would be given a token. And to get on the Temple Mount, you had to present your token showing that you had been ceremonially cleansed. Now, before a priest could go in the temple, what did he have to do? He had to wash. There was a big brass bowl, huge thing, and he had to wash carefully before he had thought.
I always wonder about that because I'm assuming they didn't get naked.
No. No. At that point, they'd already had this, and then just before they went into the temple, they had to wash their hands and their face through certain, they had to hold their hands the right way.
Kind of like a surgeon.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, but God wanted them to be ceremonially clean before they went into the temple. So the Jews understood baptism very well. So when Jesus started talking about it, John talked about it, Paul talked about it, the Jews knew exactly what baptism was. It was a washing. They understood that. They also understood that it's an immersion. There was no question about that. Jewish weddings were a big deal. They're talked about a lot in the Bible because they were so important to the Jews. Jewish life was hard. But the one time of your life when you were allowed to be happy was at your wedding. The Jews made a big deal out of weddings. A wedding took an entire week to pull off. They went all out. To understand Joseph and Mary's situation, we have to understand the Jewish wedding situation. Now, ordinarily, when a young man wanted to get married, he found a young lady that appealed to him. He would get his parents, and they would go visit the family of the girl. And they would say, our son wants to marry your daughter, so let's work it out. And so then they would decide on the bride price. How much is she worth? If she was real pretty, she might get 12 goats, 2 cows, 17 chickens, whatever. I had to pay 150 sheep for Sharon. It was my finest sheep, too. And then you would sign the banns. That's what they called them. You'd write it out. And then the girl would have to have a dowry. She would bring a dowry into the wedding. Her father would have to provide her with a dowry. Now, this also is important in discussions about marriage and divorce. And so once they signed the banns, under Jewish law, they were legally married. I mean, right there and then. But they did not start living together, and the marriage was not consummated. The groom then would go with his parents home. Now, if he dropped dead in the coming year, the girl was considered a widow, even though they'd never lived together. But once they signed the banns, they were legally married in the eyes of the law. They were man and wife. So when Joseph signed the banns with Mary and went home, and then she came up with child, what did he know? She had to be unfaithful to him because they hadn't slept together. Now, under the Jewish law, they were legally married. And what's the penalty for adultery? Death. Joseph could have publicly condemned her and had her stoned to death. But the Bible says Joseph did not want to put her to public disgrace. That's what that means. She would have been stoned to death. So he quietly divorced her. You had to write out a document in front of witnesses, and you would divorce your spouse. Now, God allowed this only under very rigid circumstances. Of course, by the time of Christ, guess what? They did it for any and every reason. Divorce was very common in Israel. God hated it. But there were 2 schools of rabbinical thought that were predominant by the time of Christ. There was a school of brain went dead. Oh well. There were 2 schools of rabbinical thought. One school said the only reason you could divorce your wife was because of infidelity, if she was unfaithful to you. The other school said that, Well, if she said mean things about you in public, you could divorce her. If she burned the biscuits, you could divorce her. I mean, basically any reason you want. Guess which view was more popular? Also, you remember Jesus talked about this on a couple occasions. He said, now what the Jews were doing, what many of the Jewish males were doing, is they were divorcing, or they were kicking them out, but they were not giving them a certificate of divorce. To divorce a woman under the Jewish law, you had to sign the certificate in front of witnesses and present it to your wife, and then you were legally divorced. But what a lot of these guys figured is, aha, if I just kick her out and don't divorce her legally, then I can keep the dowry. Yeah. And so when Jesus was talking about this, that's what he was referring to. He says, you guys are not legally divorcing these women, so if they go out and find another man, what's their situation? They're committing adultery because they're still married to you legally. So he says, I think we've taken those passages a little out of context when we've applied them to marriage and divorce and remarriage in this culture. But in those days, that was the problem. Divorce was so common, and the Jews were abusing the situation. At any rate, when you got married, you signed the banns. You went home the groom would go home for a year, and he would build a room on to his house, for his parents' house, to move his bride into. I tried to get Rebecca to do that, but she just didn't go for it. Yes.
You said they signed the bands. When we think of bands, we think of wedding bands, obviously. Gold, but what
right.
Are these bands made of?
No. The bands were just the document. Yeah. You signed the document called the bands, and that made it legal. And then at the end of a year, during that year, he would go home and prepare a place for his bride. She would get ready for the wedding. She would get her clothing ready. She'd get all her trousseau and everything ready for the wedding. At the end of a year, then the groom, they would set a day, and the groom and all of his buddies and all of his family and all of his friends, they'd have a big procession. If she lived in another town, then they would all go to her town, and so several of Jesus's parables talked about, the coming of the bridegroom, and so that's what he's referring to. Now, in those days, they didn't have clocks, and you weren't sure how long it would take you to walk from one village to the next, so you had an approximate time. And so when it talked about the 10 virgins that were unprepared for the wedding, and so forth. That's all part of this culture. So then the groom would come to the bride's village, and they would have a whole week of wedding. The bride and groom would march through the streets of the village, and they would dress up in robes, and they would have crowns on their heads. I mean, it was a big deal. Yes?
I wonder when they got up to do their vows, if they actually hung a band around their neck. I wonder when it changed from a documented paper to a...
Well, they would...
Gold.
I think the Jews would use a necklace. Yeah.
So eventually it turned
Right.
into a
Yeah.
ring.
Yeah. That's something else. Well, you can see the necklace around her neck here.
So it changed from a necklace to
Yeah.
a ring.
Right. At any rate, they would have the ceremony, and it would be a big deal, and the family would throw a big feast, and every night they would drink, and it was a big party. That's why Jesus talked about weddings so much, because the Jews, that was a big part of their lives. They just loved weddings, and it was a party and a celebration, and it was great. Here's some of the traditional outfits that they might have worn. Now, when I went to Israel, we went to the Wailing Wall, which is the only part of the temple still standing. And the Jews today, they have the wall divided into two sections. You've got the men's side and the women's side, and neither one can go the other way. The men only go to the men's side, the women, except on his wedding day. The day we were there, they had a wedding. And so the groom was allowed to go with the bride down to the women's side of the Wailing Wall. And it was so cool to watch him, you know. But yes?
What do you do if you don't know if you're a man or woman?
The Jews never had that issue. That was not a problem in ancient Judea. They knew pretty well. A big part of Jewish life and worship were the festivals. God established 3 festivals, and he ordered the Jews to attend. It was an entire week of worship to God. Now, the Jews would also worship every day, but this entire week was set aside as a given to God. I'm going to worship God for an entire week. And each of the festivals would celebrate something different. First of all was Passover. Passover was to remember the delivery from Egyptian slavery. This is the week that Jesus died, was the week of Passover. This was held in the spring. It was also known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. What's the unleavened bread? Leaven is yeast. Yeast stood for sin in God's theology. And so part of observing the Passover was that all the leaven must be removed from the house in time for the Passover meal. Matter of fact, the Jews made a game of it for their children. They would hide leaven, and the children would have to go to the house and find the leaven and get rid of it. So they got the kids involved. And so the Jews observe Passover every year, still do. The Jews still observe this one of the festivals. And it was a big deal. They worship God. They thank God as a nation. It's kind of like our Thanksgiving that takes a whole week. And they would observe this and thank God for delivering them from slavery. Slavery was the big deal to the Jews. Then there was Pentecost. This is the day the church had its origins. But it was also known as the ingathering. This was in June at the harvest time. And they would, at the harvest time, then they would, this was 50 days, Penta, carries with the idea of 5. They would have this feast for a whole week, and they would thank God for the crops, that God had blessed them and given them. Israel only gets an average of about 10 inches of rain a year. How much does Oklahoma get? Sir? Around 30. And it's kind of dry in Oklahoma. Can you imagine if you only get 10 inches? So crops were a big deal. And if the rains didn't come, it could be a rough year in Israel. Now, around Judea got the 10 inches. Galilee got a lot more. So Galilee was a lot richer farmland than Judea. Judea was used primarily as pasture land because it was harder to grow stuff. But every year there were 2 rainy seasons. And if you missed the rainy season, you were hurting. That's why the Jews had so many wells and cisterns. The word cistern applies, you read about a lot in Scripture. What's a cistern? Yeah, it's just a big hole. It's kind of like what we call a pond. Except they would usually line it with rocks, and they would let the rains fill it up, and then they would use the cistern. You remember Joseph was thrown into a cistern, which is a big hole in the ground, usually lined with rocks. It's usually pretty deep to catch water. And so harvest was a big deal in Israel, and so God would have them observe the festival. Then there was the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Booths. This was held in September. This was a cool time in Israel. Every Jew would build a temporary hut. At this time, in Jerusalem, the streets were full of these temporary shacks. They would take branches and boards, and they build a kind of a homeless shelter, if you will. And the people would all move out into the streets for a week, or up on the roof, or wherever they built their little hut. And this was to remind them of when they were in the wilderness, wandering from Egypt to Canaan. And the children this would be kind of a party for the kids, and we do this because God delivered us, and we traveled through the wilderness. But this was another time of celebration. Now, when you read in the New Testament, you read about some weird things going on, and you wonder, why are they doing that? A lot of what Jesus taught came out of these festivals. You remember he talked about the I am the light of the world? That was at one of these festivals when they had the lights up, and I'll talk about that one in a minute. In one of these festivals, there would be a big procession and singing and dancing and a big party, and the high priest would take a silver pitcher, and they would march all the way from the temple down to the Gihon spring, and they would fill the pitcher with water and carry it back up. And so, I mean, it was these things were big. They did a lot of singing, they did a lot of eating, they did a lot of partying. I mean, these were happy times. These weren't, serious church services. These were happy times. God wanted these festivals, they were called festivals. God wanted them to be happy and to sing and to show their gratitude toward Him and to remember Him. Now, when in the days of Esther, you remember when Haman tried to have all the Jews murdered? You remember that story? God delivered the Jews from Haman's atrocities, and they had to. They started these some of these festivals dealt with that. When we talked about the time when the Greeks came in and offered a pig on the altar and desecrated the temple. So Hanukkah was the festival of lights. And it was at this festival that Jesus talked about, I am the light of the world. And so this was held in December. It was to celebrate the rededication of the temple. Now God did not order this one. This was one the Jews began to observe on their own. And they would build huge candelabra around the city. These things had big bowls on the poles. They would hold gallons of olive oil. And they would actually use the underwear of the priest as wicks. I'm not sure what but I guess they were considered holy underwear. I don't know. But the whole city would be lit by these massive fires. And so Jesus would use these to teach truths. And when he talked about, I am the water of life, well, that was during the festival when they were carrying the water from the Gihon spring and so forth. So a lot of stuff is just amazing how it fits all together. The Jews to this day observe Hanukkah. That's about Christmas time. So the Festival of Lights, yeah. And then there was Purim. This was the time of Haman's atrocities, and God saved them from destruction. And so they observed Purim in the late winter and early spring. This was when they were saved by God. So the Jews observed 5 festivals. 3 of them were required by God. The other 2 they picked up on their own. But these festivals were an important part of Jewish life. All the Jews within so many miles were required to come, and then every Jew in the world was required to come every so often to one of the festivals. So it was an important time for the Jews. And it was a time when Jesus was executed, and one of the festivals was a time when his church was established. So these were big in the Jew. So when you read about it in the New Testament, that's what it's talking about. These festivals were times when the Jews would get together and observe something to worship God. And obviously, during these festivals, the temple was real busy. You would have thousands upon thousands of animals sacrificed during 1 week. It's estimated that 250,000 animals were sacrificed during Passover. Can you imagine how much blood 250,000 animals would shed? I mean, it's just unreal. That's why there were like 20-something thousand priests serving at the temple. Yes, sir.
When they had to present these animals for sacrifice, is that one per person, one per family?
Usually one per family. Usually it was for a family. Yeah. But can you imagine slicing the throat of 250,000 animals and catching the blood? And I mean, oh yeah, yeah. I'm sure glad that's not part of my job as a preacher, is to sacrifice animals. But can you imagine the smell? And of course, the priests used this to get rich. I talked a couple of weeks ago about how the high priest had figured out, aha, I can make money off of this. And so he was making a killing off providing the animals. Jerusalem was surrounded by flocks of sheep and cows, and he would bring them in, and when you brought your animal, they would turn it down, say, well, this one's not perfect enough, but we'll sell you one of ours. And on average, you paid 3 times the going rate. So if you could buy a cow for $10, he'd sell you one for 30, and he was making a big profit. And then there was the money changing, because when you went to the temple, you had to pay the temple tax. And they would say, sorry, we can't accept your money because it's from Rome, but we'll trade it for some of our money, and we'll only charge you a 7% fee to change it. So the high priest was making millions. I mean, they were getting filthy rich. That's why they wanted Jesus dead. The high priest said, man, if he declares himself the Messiah, I'm out of business. And when you start taking millions of dollars away from a guy, he gets real narrow-minded about it. And then there was the Day of Atonement. In some ways, this was the most important day of the year. This is also known as Yom Kippur. The Jews still observe that. This was held in the fall. It's the national repentance and atonement. Now, in the Old Testament, how did they observe this day? Under the law, how did they observe it? Well, I'm glad you asked. The high priest would select a bull and 2 goats. He would then slaughter the bull, cut its throat, take the blood from the bull. He would go into the most holy place. Now, this is the only day of the year that anyone could go into the most holy place. He would go in. Now, what's in the most holy place? The Ark of the Covenant. He would carry the blood of the bull into the most holy place and pour it on the top of the Ark of the Covenant. This is where the presence of God was. And he did this for his own sins. He had to clear his own sin debt before he could. Matter of fact, the Hebrew writer makes a big argument out of this. He says the human priests had to clear their own sins. Jesus doesn't have to. He would then go back out and take the 2 goats that had been selected and draw lots. One of the goats was selected as the sacrificial lamb. The other one was selected as the scapegoat. He would cut the throat of the sacrificial lamb, catch its blood, go back into the most holy place, pour the blood on top of the Ark of the Covenant. This was for the sins of all the people. He would then go back out to the scapegoat, put his hands on the head of the scapegoat, and ceremonially take all the sins of the people and put them on the goat. They would then lead the goat out into the wilderness and let it go. What's the symbology here? The sins are taken out of the camp. And so it's amazing all the things that they went through. And you read about this stuff, and so that's what he's talking about.
How scary that must have been for the high priest.
Oh, yeah.
Once a year, and
yeah.
the presence of God is in there.
Yeah.
Mess up,
you're dead. They actually sewed bells on the bottom of his robe in case he did that, and then they would tie a rope to his foot. And they were scared if he went in there and offended God and God struck him dead, who's going to go get him? Nobody else could go in. So they could pull him out. No record of that ever happened, but they considered that. So yeah, that was a scary time. Can you imagine, for one time a year, only one person gets to go in the presence of God? And yeah, that would have to be a fearsome thing. But that was the Day of Atonement.
I wonder how close to the Day of Atonement that Jesus crucified.
I'd have to look that up.
Because, 50 days later, that's when Peter got up and preached.
Yeah, at Pentecost. Yeah. I don't know. I'd have to look that up. All right. Let's look quickly. No, we don't have time. Have to wait till next week. All right. See you then.